Hey guys, welcome to my A-Push lecture, or welcome back to my A-Push lecture. Today we're going to be continuing talking about the Cold War, specifically here at home, the Red Scare, all right? So this is the second Red Scare. If you remember, we had one in the wake of World War I. So this is the second Red Scare here in the wake of World War II. So this takes place the late 40s, early 1950s, and it's the same idea, right? It's this intense fear of communists and that they might be trying to infiltrate American society and overthrow our government, as you can kind of see here in this very scary image, right? Is this tomorrow? And it was marked by like witch hunts, right, to root out communists in the US, especially those who might have ties to government, right, because they might be spies or they might be trying to like overthrow the government from within, okay? As you can see here, some of the other like scary propaganda, right, that goes along with the Red Scare, and how we were very fearful that communists were coming and they were going to overtake us, and how we needed to stop that. All right. In 1947, we see the beginning of what we call the Loyalty Review Board. This was started from an executive order by President Truman. And this program, over the course of a few years, basically investigated federal employees. In fact, over 3 million federal employees were investigated by this organization, by this Loyalty Review Board, for possible communist ties. And people were called into these meetings and they were questioned, for hours on end, interrogated, that they're sister's neighbor's friend at one point, got a flyer from the socialist or communist party, 10 years ago or whatever. There was all this fear, all this questioning of that, all right? We also see investigations from Congress, specifically HUAC, which is the House of Representatives Committee on Un-American Activity, which is probably one of the best named House committees. It was actually formed in 1938. Its stated goal was to investigate, quote, subversion, which at the time meant like Americans with ties to Nazi Germany. But then, of course, after the war, it became very concerned with possible communists, right? With not just about people who may have positions in government, but just prominent positions in American society in general. So there were specific concerns about the government as well as the media, specifically Hollywood. Teachers were a big subject of their investigation as well, right? Because teachers are there shaping young minds. One case in particular was this one in 1948, the Alger Hiss case. Alger Hiss was a State Department worker, and he was investigated. The investigation was actually led by this guy, a young congressman from California, future President Richard Nixon. All right. He was accused of being a member of the Communist Party and being a Soviet spy, but was not actually convicted of espionage, but of perjury, which is lying under oath. All right. But there were tons of investigations. Hopefully, you guys saw in some of those the Century videos, the Hollywood 10 case, some of those directors and producers that were blacklisted because they thought, they might have communist ties. And what we see is this really relates to what we see going on in the wake of World War II. We get this kind of constant state of war. In 1947, the National Security Act is going to reorganize defense and intelligence. So it replaces the old Department of War. And now we have the Department of Defense, and it kind of centralized all the military and intelligence agencies because now there's this great need to have all this intelligence against the Soviets, against communists, both abroad and here at home. All right. So it creates the Department of Defense, which operates during war and peace, which the War Department really only existed, during war. All right. And it operates, of course, at the Pentagon right outside of Washington, D.C. You can see here how it's kind of organized. There's the Department of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, right? There's all these other agencies that go along with it, the Joint Chiefs of staff, defense intelligence, and all that kind of stuff. It is quite complicated how the Defense Department works. And we get agencies like the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, that are here collecting intelligence, both again abroad and here at home. In 1948, we see the passage of the Selective Service Act. This is going to update the draft, and it's basically the modern system for our modern draft. So all males over 18 must register. And the draft was active from 1948 to 1973. All right. One thing I want to point out that's going to have some implications later is that it had exceptions for college. So you could defer being drafted if you were enrolled in college. So many young men chose to go to college to avoid the draft, right? But it does create this separation between those who can afford to go to college and those who can't. So we start to see poor people being kind of disproportionately drafted, all right? Also in 1948, we see a presidential election here, all right? I always like to show this picture because it was thought that the Republican Dewey was going to beat Harry Truman, but he got some help out west, kind of later in the election night, winning some of these big states out here. And so President Truman is going to serve essentially what is a second term because his first term was almost all of FDR's last term. All right. President Truman, though, is not going to start off that term very well. Just a few months after he takes office in September of 1949, he announced that the U.S. did find out that the Soviets had successfully tested their first atomic weapon. This was about 3 years before many of the leading scientists thought it was possible, right? And this is going to have two big implications. First of all, the US no longer has this monopoly on nuclear weapons, right? So this means the arms race is on. And that's going to be a huge part of the Cold War, this arms race, as you can see here, between us and the Soviets, all right? The other big effect that this is going to have is it's going to increase this Red Scare, this fear of communists, of spies especially, all right? What we see is this arms race is going to get bigger and more scary. In 1952, the U.S. successfully tested the hydrogen bomb, and the Soviets followed a year later. This is about 400 to 500 times more powerful than the regular old atomic bombs that we used in like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so, as you can see, we kind of get the lead on the Soviets here. They will catch up with us later and build a ton of nuclear weapons, but this ends up being a little bit of a problem for them because their economy cannot really handle this level of nuclear weapons and how costly they are. So we'll revisit that later, okay? Also, if you remember in 1949, this is when we have the Chinese Communist Revolution, right? China falls to communism. And so these two things are going to really serve to increase this fear that we see ongoing in the second Red Scare. So the Soviets getting nuclear technology, the Communist Revolution in China is going to intensify this, right? Especially those fears of spying, all right? A good example of this is the Rosenberg case. The Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted of selling nuclear secrets to the Soviets. Julius Rosenberg had worked on the Manhattan Project, and they ended up being investigated and convicted of selling these nuclear secrets to the Soviets. One of the reasons why they got that technology so quickly. And they were actually executed in 1953. Later evidence that came out many decades later after it was declassified proved that Julius actually was a spy and he did sell nuclear secrets to the Soviets, but that Ethel had not really been involved. And so she and her children were very much punished for something that they didn't really have a lot of power in. And that brings us to Joseph McCarthy, the kind of height of the Red Scare here. Joseph McCarthy was a new senator. He was the freshman senator from Wisconsin who really used the Red Scare to his own personal and political advantage, basically to get clout, as we would say nowadays. In February of 1950, he was at this event and he literally held up this list claiming that he had this list of communists in the State Department. All right. He never actually produced this list, but he made all these outlandish accusations, and it was such a climate of fear. You can see Joseph McCarthy right here. It was such this climate of fear that people believed him, right? People were really scared about what was happening in the world and wanted to make sure our government was safe. McCarthy went on to claim that other top government officials had communist ties as well, including the military. In 1954, millions of people watched the Army McCarthy hearings on TV, where he sat and questioned military officials and whatnot. And so this just really showed that McCarthy was kind of full of it. He didn't really have a lot of evidence to back up his claims, and that this Red Scare was really turning into like a witch hunt, right? And that it wasn't really producing any communists or spies or, traitors or anything. And it was basically just hurting, Americans, right? And some of the things that we hold dear, like free speech. So again, there is Joseph McCarthy there. And one of the things that actually helped bring him down as well is this See It Now program. It was one of the very first television news programs. This very famous journal, Edward R. Murrow, did this whole special on this TV show called See It Now, where he, brought all these clips of McCarthy and just basically proved that McCarthy was spouting all these claims without any evidence, and that he was doing way, way more harm than good. All right. There's actually a good movie about this called Good Night and Good Luck. Came out about 10 or 15 years ago with George Clooney. It's a really good one. You guys should check it out. All right, so we're going to stop there. That was the Cold War lecture, specifically on the Red Scare.